Hello, everyone. I'm Danny Yanez, Executive Director of Seraphic Fire. Welcome to tonight's lecture on Baroque Angels Behind the Walls, featuring our Artistic Director and co-founder, Patrick Dupre Quigley, and Professor Craig A. Monson, Professor Emeritus of Music at Washington University in St. Louis. Tonight, they'll explore the hidden world of 18th century Italian convents, where remarkable women composed music that transcended the walls around them. Please keep yourself muted during the lecture. We'll have the time for questions at the end. We're recording tonight's session, and it will be available on our YouTube channel and on the Seraphic Saturday podcast, so feel free to share it with friends. We'll hope you'll join us for our final concert of the season, Baroque Angels Behind the Walls, conducted by Patrick, April 10th through the 13th in Boca Raton, Coral Gables, Fort Lauderdale, and Naples. Tickets are available on our website, seraphicfire.org. Thank you for being here. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Danny. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Patrick Quigley. I'm the Artistic Director of Seraphic Fire. Thank you so much for being here. Our final show, as Danny said, of our 22nd season, which is titled Music History 101, we've named Baroque Angels Behind the Walls. It focuses on convent music in the 17th and 18th century Italian peninsula. This is the final installment of our series of presentations by music historians from some of America's top universities. Our collaborating scholars have consulted on the content of our programs, written articles, contributed program notes, and are participating in an online series of lectures, of which this is the final one. Our guest and scholar this evening is Dr. Craig Monson, the Paul Tietjens Professor Emeritus of Music at Washington University in St. Louis. He is particularly knowledgeable on the repertoire of our concerts. Dr. Monson's books include Nuns Behaving Badly, Music, Magic, Art, and Arson in the Convents of Italy. Also, Divas in the Convent, Nuns, Music, and Defiance in 17th century Italy, and Habitual Offenders, a true tale of nuns, prostitutes, and murders in the 17th century Italy. Craig, welcome to Seraphic Fire.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm very happy that you've decided to give wider exposure to this repertoire, which remains comparatively little known.
Yes, as we were planning this concert, and you and I were talking about a year ago, um, I was I was shocked at how little of this music I had encountered in a musical education over the course of 22, 23 years, that I'd really never heard of any of these composers except for, say, Vivaldi. Where did you start to become in contact with the repertoire that we're going to talk about tonight?
Well, it was a happy accident. I had gone on vacation to Florence and decided to visit all the museums that none of the tourists visited. And in one of them, there was a large, elaborate music manuscript. And I thought, gee, I could write an article on that. So I came back the following summer and indulged in all sorts of musicological skullduggery and managed to trace the manuscript to the city of Bologna and to a specific convent in Bologna, and traced it to the possession of a specific nun. And it was a large keyboard manuscript that contained keyboard reductions of vocal pieces. And amongst them was one that had the text that translates something like, "You who have that little thing that pleases and delights so much, run your hand up my cassock." And this wasn't the sort of thing I associated with nuns and nun musicians. So I thought, well, I have tenure. Why not explore this area, which at that point was very little known at all. Not much had been done on it. And so for the next 35, 40 years, I spent most of my time either in Bologna in the archives or in the Vatican secret archive looking for traces of convent music.
Wow, that is fascinating. Well, okay, so before we get to the meat of the repertoire, um, can we start with some basics? So, could you give us an idea of what we might consider to be the Baroque period in terms of dates and style, and maybe what distinguishes it from what came before it and what came after it?
Right. Well, the dates are reasonably straightforward. I mean, we can say it starts at 1600, which is basically when opera gets going, and ends in 1750, which is the death of Bach. As to what the quintessential features of the period are, I thought, well, I should know that. I've been teaching it for years. And then I started to try to sit down and categorize it, and sort of ran into a wall. So I thought, I'll just ask AI. So I questioned AI, what are the characteristics of Baroque music? And I received a little paragraph, and I read it and I went, no, no, no. And so I had to fall back on sort of what the Baroque means to me. And I think the most important things about the Baroque, in my opinion, are styles that set out to amaze, dazzle, create wonder, and arouse emotions in an audience. And an audience is essential to Baroque music. I mean, for me, I can't imagine a Baroque piece without an audience to hear it and respond to it. And that's a great reason for doing Baroque music live, because an audience is there actually experiencing it in the flesh rather than on some little thing stuck in their ear.
Right.
And so the styles are designed to create wonder and astonishment and dazzle an audience. So, for example, there's lots of contrasts of tempo, slow, fast, loud, soft, triple time, duple time, major key, minor key, solo voice versus chorus, voices versus instruments, small groups of voices versus large groups of voices. The feature that AI singled out as most important was counterpoint. And my reaction was, no, counterpoint is what characterized the previous period. And in fact, at the beginning of the Baroque, Vincenzo Galilei, the father of the astronomer, wrote a treatise espousing the virtues of solo singing, which is a main feature of the Baroque. And he condemned polyphony, counterpoint, because you have several voices all singing at the same time, and they cancel out the individual emotions associated with the different vocal ranges. So counterpoint, the reason counterpoint comes into the picture is, of course, because of Bach. But Bach is important for the 19th century, and he was not a major influence during the Baroque itself. Baroque is really about opera, and opera above everything else, and then other vocal forms like oratorio and cantata. It's also the first period in which we find idiomatic music for large instrumental ensembles, and repertories specifically created for those sorts of groups. Concerti,
Sure.
for example.
Yeah.
Let's see what there. Another thing that I think that's important and worth remembering is how much Baroque music is about the performance as much as the piece. When you read what 17th century commentators say, they talk about the performance, the singers. They rarely, if ever, mention the pieces being performed. So they didn't have this modern day obsession with this great masterwork versus that. And so they'll mention specific singers. They'll mention that it was double choir, triple choir, and sometimes they make a point of mentioning whether chocolate was served after the performance and if there were enough firecrackers. Because the other thing we don't realize is one way they dazzled audiences at convent performances was by shooting off hundreds of firecrackers and guns.
Really?
Oh
Wow.
yeah,
This
yeah. So the next historically informed performance I hear, I want to include firecrackers set off in the back of the hall.
this is amazing. Well, sometimes we perform on Lincoln Road, so there you get all sorts of noises coming into the show.
Okay,
So,
okay. But
uh,
again, it's all about dazzling the audience, and so it's impossible to think about Baroque music, I think, without an audience there to be moved um, and aroused.
yeah.
It's also about the performers. I think one needs to remember that in Baroque pieces, the performers are co-creators with the composers, because to some extent the scores are only kind of generalized maps, and the performers have to improvise both in terms of ornamentation and other details, especially the player of the basso continuo part.
So and for our uh, for our friends who are with us, those of you who saw our last concert, we had a basso to continuo group for the classical period, which usually includes a bowed bass line of some sort, a cello or a single line or a bassoon, but also includes figured bass line. So this means
Right.
people who play chords, and that in the last program was a harpsichordist, but it can also be the organ. It can be a lute or a guitar or a harp player. So there's many different colors that the players themselves made choices about that are not specified in the music. So as you were saying, it is. I never really thought of it as being so much about the audience and improvisation, but that really is one of the things, like the idea of affect, the idea that music can arouse a specific emotion in us really came to be during this time as a sort of an idea. So for this concert, we're focusing on music from Italy, specifically music written for the choirs and orchestras of convents. And before we talk about the music, were these convents cloistered? Was this music for private or public consumption? What was the purpose of the music that we are going to be performing, and who was it meant to be heard if an audience was indeed integral to the music of the Baroque period?
Right. Well, after the Council of Trent, which reformed Catholicism in the 1560s, nuns were strictly confined within convent walls. Before that, the rule had said you were supposed to be cloistered, but quite frankly, they often came and went. And after Trent, there were some that said, you have violated the rules, because we came here assuming we would be able to come and go as we please, but now we are confined within the walls. In terms of music, the music was supposed to be private. The nuns were singing to God and to themselves alone, but they sang in front of grilled windows or from choir lofts high up in the vaults of the church, invisibly. And it was a kind of pseudo privacy. They were singing to themselves, but there was an audience eavesdropping in the public church, and they were very aware of that audience. One of the things that demonstrates that is at one of the convents I've worked on in Bologna, the choir lofts had one window facing the nuns' inner church where the nuns were listening, and four windows facing the public. The choir loft also had three windows facing the public street. So not only could the people in the church hear them, but the music could carry over the convent wall so that the man on the street could occasionally hear the nuns singing privately.
Wow. Wow. So I mean, I've read some of the descriptions that like Bernie has written
Right,
about
right.
this. But so it seems like this became even more and more popular as people visited Italy on what we would call now the Grand Tour. And that it was it became a grand tour sort of stop, and something that you wrote in your diary and remembered was being at one of these convents for Vespers. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Grand Tour and what did contemporary writers talk about when they heard this music?
Right. The grand tours really get started in the early 17th century. There's a writer from Britain named Thomas Coriat who described his trip in a book entitled Coriat's Crudités. And I mean, you can completely recreate every place he visited because he does it in such detail. And these people would describe the churches they saw. They described the quirky behavior of the locals. In Venice, they invariably talk about the courtesans. And frequently, they talk about music in the convents because, as you said, the convents became tourist attractions, but they also served as manifestations of the prestige of the city. The people that came and heard the nuns sing were impressed by the level of culture of the particular community. And it's interesting that in cities like Milan, the best choral ensemble singing could be heard not at the cathedral, but at the convent of Santa Radegonda. And anyone who was a musical enthusiast made a point of going to Santa Radegonda to try to hear the performances. And of course, the nuns were singing invisibly behind their grills. And so that meant everybody was trying to get a peek at them. In Bologna, they were so hard, the church hierarchy was so hardcore that there were shutters that covered the windows. And the shutters were only opened at the moment during Mass when the priest elevates the host, which would become visible to the nuns in their inner chapel above the altar. But that's the moment the people in the outer chapel would be trying to kind of look and see any of the singers on the inside. So you also get Rome saying the grilled windows have to be so many feet above ground level so that nobody in the congregation can see inside. And the only one who can see inside is the priest in the pulpit when he is delivering the sermon.
That's unbelievable. So, I mean, this sounds like a pretty big scene if all of these people tourists are coming to this. Um, was it like a concert when where people would applaud after, or I mean, because it's still a church service. So what, I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, you weren't supposed to applaud. Um, um, in Venice for the Ospedale, they expressed their approval by blowing their noses, coughing, and stamping and shuffling their feet. So they made a sort of rumble, but without overtly clapping.
oh, wow.
And
Wow.
the audiences could be so big that I know of one case where the bishop was trying to get to the church to shut down the performance because he thought it was so, you know, immodest, and he couldn't get to the convent because the streets were blocked by the carriages of all the rich people who had gotten there ahead of him.
I mean, this is such an interesting part of history and something that I mean, I certainly know very little about. So there's people are coming to what is in essence a musical happening in a sacred space performed by a set of people, in this case women, who they can't see. So who were the women in these convents, and was this the life that they chose? I mean, is this did they enter these convents in order to be part of this life?
Well, some did, but a lot perhaps wouldn't have chosen the life. It's interesting that in the aristocracy, large percentages of the daughters of the aristocracy were destined for the convent. A family would marry off maybe one or two daughters, but because a husband in the world required such a large dowry, there was such dowry inflation, the rest were all sent to the convent, where a dowry was perhaps 1/10 of what a husband would require. But it was very common for young girls to be taken to the convent when they were very young. I've seen examples of girls as young as 2 taken to the convent. And the customary thing was for them to be raised within the convent by their aunts. So
Oh,
the aunts sort of smoothed the way from the palace door to the convent door, and then took them in, doted upon them, gave them a relatively pleasant life. So if this was the only life really that they had known, having entered the convent, the minimum age legally was 7, but there are any number of cases I've found where there are 2 or 4. And they basically grew up within the convent wall with their aunts serving as effectively their mothers. This was the only life they knew. And so
so
they would accept it.
wow. Is were all the women who were in these convents, or at least the ones that we talk about musically? I know the Ospedale was an orphanage, but in terms
Right.
of the cloister convents that didn't have orphanages involved, were they all from families of means, or did they
They,
also?
they, I mean, in Bologna, for example, there were 24 convents,
Oh,
and the great majority of them were for the upper class. And their dowries, which were substantial, though much less than a husband would require, were substantial because this was a way of preserving social purity, keeping the riffraff out. On the other hand, if it was a convent that emphasized music, they needed good singers. And so they would offer dowry discounts to talented musicians. So effectively, a woman, maybe from the middle class or upper middle class, could afford to enter the convent with a dowry discount, and therefore, in effect, move up socially into the ranks of the so-called professe, the professed nuns, the choir nuns,
hmm.
who represented the creme de la creme of the city. So there was a real advantage, if your daughter had musical talent, of developing that talent, because you could get her in a convent for a deeply discounted dowry, commonly 50% off and sometimes completely free. And how useful this was is demonstrated in Florence, for example, in the late 1600s. The archbishop stipulated to the convent known as the convent Le Murate, which means the walled-in ones. He stipulated that dowry discounts could only be offered to outstanding singers. So there really was an advantage to exploiting your musicality.
uh, so as you said, some of these women came from middle class families where they were trained in music, and I. In the article that you wrote for our program, you talked about how most of the music that these women sang were by men, by male
Right.
composers. But 3 of the 4 composers on this program were themselves members of the convents for which they wrote. So did they all receive their musical training prior to entering the convent, or were they trained also as part of convent life?
Um, it varies. One of the composers on the program, I can't remember if it's Pericona or Maida, was taught by her uncle and another musician before she actually entered the convent. Um, Many of the musicians were actually educated by their aunts, who were also musicians. So they would come into the convent, and their aunts would breed them up as musicians. Um, in some cases, if they were really good, the nuns would then try to find a, organist of the cathedral or choir master of some basilica to come and give them lessons as well. But that was a practice that was often frowned upon. In Bologna, for example, the only composer ever to publish her music, Lucretia Orsina Vizzana, entered the convent in the care of her aunt, who was the organist, who probably gave her initial instruction. But once she outstripped her aunt's capabilities, the nuns secretly hired the choir master of the Basilica of San Petronio, who taught her from 1615 until 1622, when the church hierarchy discovered this ruse, because it was against the law, but the nuns did it anyway. And so at that point, that practice ended. Um,
It just, it just quite an unbelievable story. And but there's also this great music. Can you, if you were to like describe this music, particularly the music of uh, Cozzolani and Pericona and Maida, um, what does it sound like? How much of the texts were liturgically mandated, and how much was part of what the composer had agency over?
right. Well, in perhaps 95% of the cases, the texts are in Latin. The nuns were forbidden to sing vernacular pieces. There are a few that are in the vernacular and are still sacred, and those may have been used as so-called canzoncelle, little songs to be sung when they were enjoying periods of recreation. But the vast majority are in Latin, and the Latin texts tend to rework biblical verses or liturgical texts. But in most cases, they don't fit precisely into the liturgy. So they were often performed as what we would now call motets, and commonly at places like the end of Vespers. In Bologna, for example, in the 1580s, the stipulation said it is okay for the nuns to sing a motet or two at the end of Vespers, which was a kind of non-liturgical spot. Um,
Sure.
so the Pericona and Maida pieces fit into that category. They kind of modify or emulate biblical or liturgical texts. One of them actually says for a sacred virgin or martyr, and so presumably that could have been used on the feast day of some saint. The Cozzolani piece, O Cele Cives, O Citizens of Heaven, is asking about where the tomb of St. Catherine is. So presumably that could have been used for the feast of St. Catherine of Siena.
Mhm.
The minority of the pieces, I think you could say, actually fit in some liturgical context. And in this case, the Cozzolani Laetatus Sum, I was glad, sets a psalm that is specified for Vespers. Interestingly enough, it's set for the Vespers as performed at by the their specific religious order in the Church of Santa Radegonda. So she published this collection, but buyers of the collection, if they were sticklers for liturgical propriety, couldn't always perform it because they didn't use the specific liturgy of Santa Radegonda. My guess is they sort of thought, well, we can sort of be a little flexible.
Butts it a little bit. Yeah. The
Yeah.
so it and how often did the how often did the nuns sing? Was it once a week? Was it multiple times a day? Or
Well, I mean, they sang the Opus Dei, or the work of God of the choir nuns, or professe, was to sing the services, the 8 services of the day. Now, most of those would be in Gregorian chant, but on the festivals of the convent, they would sing polyphony, and then they might sing vespers and they might sing mass as well, or they'd sing first vespers on the day before, then mass and vespers on the feast day.
and I mean it's pretty intense. And I've been in Rome to some of the cloistered convents where women still sing on a regular basis. But I it must have been quite the life to have to learn new music in the course of also singing 8 services a day. It was their life outside of service just basically spent in rehearsal?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because at the convent of San Paolo in Milan, music flourished in the late 16th century. And one of the older nuns who didn't quite approve complained, in the old, what did she say? These days the singers are too much admired. They can't come to obligations and to mortifications, because they can't be saddened or they won't be able to sing. In the old days, the singers washed the dishes and waited at table. So in addition to getting this, a dowry discount, in some cases, the nun musicians also lived a slightly more gratifying lifestyle. They didn't have to perform the more mundane tasks that the other nuns had to perform. In terms of singing 8 services a day, remember that before long they would know it all from memory, the
Sure.
chant. I mean, in monastic houses where they sing the daily round of services, I've heard of a director of the choir who only looks at the service book at the beginning to remind himself what's up for the day, and then they all sing it all from memory. So they would have needed to rehearse and practice the special music for the feast days, but those would only happen a few times a year,
Okay.
depending on the order and, which particular feasts they observed.
Wow. So getting into like sort of specific people, the most prolific composer from the 17th century convent tradition was Chiara Margherita Cozzolani. So who was she, and how long was she active as a composer? And was it her whole life, or did she have a period of activity that was
Right, right.
more?
Well, in fact, Cozzolani isn't the most prolific.
Oh,
There's a composer named Isabella Leonarda who published no fewer than 19 volumes.
oh my gosh.
I mean, what else was she doing all these years,
Yeah.
And in my opinion, Cozzolani is a much better composer than Leonarda. Cozzolani came from an upper middle class family. that customarily sent its daughters to Santa Radegonda. And she was born in about, I think, 1602 and entered the convent when she was 17 and took her vows when she was 18. She was joining her family. She already had a sister there, and two of her aunts were there, and eventually two of her own nieces would join her there, and they would become musicians as well. We don't really know how she learned music. We do know that in the palace next door to where her parents lived, there was a family of musicians. So it's possible that her earliest education derived from tuition with them. But once she gets to the convent, we don't really know. I mean, it's possible that the same thing happened with Lucretia Vizzana in Bologna. They brought in an outsider. There are a lot of petitions over the years in various convents where convents will write and ask for permission to bring in a maestro di cappella to teach a talented nun. Sometimes they're rejected, but sometimes they're given that permission. The Catholic Church is anything but monolithic. Practice changes from city to city and within a city from one bishop to the next. You can have a pro-music bishop followed by an anti-music bishop. So there's no general rule. It's interesting, once she starts to practice music, she doesn't publish her first collection till she's almost 30, which is rather late. And then all 4 collections appear before 1650. And after that, she has a fallow period. It could be because, like many nun musicians of talent and imagination, she ends up in a position of power. She ends up both as the abbess and the prioress, and that would have taken a lot of time. So she may have had to cut back on music because of that.
It's interesting how much of an analog she is, and some of the people that you write about are to even Hildegard of Bingen, who was living a similar, as starts out as comes in as a young person and has particular musical talent, is sort of proclaimed the head of her congregation and then leads them onward to more and greater musical sort of adventures. So this is not necessarily a new idea for the 17th and 18th century, but perhaps the publication of this music is something that's very different.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember the earliest publication by a nun, but it's in maybe the 1570, something like that. And between then and the end of the 18th century, about 75% of the music published by women was by nuns. But it's also worth remembering that in addition, we get so hung up on composers, but they were hung up more, I think, on performers. And a lot of male composers wrote music for specific nun musicians or for specific convents of musicians. So there's probably more music dedicated to nuns than composed by nuns that formed part of their repertoire.
Did they have the means to be able to commission music for their convents, or were
Presumably some did. I mean, but again, it varies how rich the house was. In Bologna at Santa Cristina, which is the convent I know best, there are 5 collections dedicated to different nuns at the convent, which probably means that those individual nuns who were wealthy used some of their private income. Of course, they weren't supposed to own property, but that was another thing that got sort of glossed over. And I can tell you how they did it. So these individual nuns probably paid for the publication, which then was used in the convent.
Wow. It's amazing how much even the creation of this music has some sort of like hidden subversion behind
Well,
it.
I mean, nuns were the control that was exercised by the male hierarchy over these women and their bodies, you know, was a major reality in their life. So they became experts at working within and around the rules and prohibitions that were put upon them. And one of the things that makes this obvious is how often the prohibitions get republished. Because if everybody is observing the law, you don't have to keep republishing it every 2 years. And of course, the other thing, legally, if the rule wasn't published, it wasn't legal. So often the convents would say, oh, well, we never got a copy of that. So they started in the prohibitions, adding at the end, this has to be read in chapter every week so that no one can feign ignorance.
Oh my gosh.
So it's
So
all about, they found ways of working within and around the rules and through powerful patrons. And again, this is one of the things that made music so useful, because it drew all these other aristocratic families to the convent to hear them. And in many cases, they could be enlisted as supporters in the world beyond the wall. And we do know that they took advantage of this. There's a musical case in Bologna in about 1700 when they run afoul of the bishop, the current bishop, who says nobody can sing anymore and you all are going to be, you're deprived of your veil, and so they petitioned to Rome. And in addition to petitioning the cardinals, they petitioned the cardinals' mothers.
oh,
Because, you know, female solidarity. The mothers will intercede with their sons. And ultimately, in this case, the nun musician won.
incredible.
Yeah.
So, moving back to our, this is a, a mind-blowing situation. Moving back to one of our composers, Cozzolani, she it's not. It's clearly from our talk already today. It's clearly not an isolated incident, but she and her congregation ran into some controversy with the local church leadership. Can you tell us what happened in Milan?
Right. It's Milan and Bologna are probably the cities where there was the most conflict about music. And early in Cozzolani's career, there were bishops that were reasonably sympathetic to music, or they didn't make waves. In fact, her first published collection is dedicated to one of those archbishops. But then in the 1660s, Archbishop Alfonso Lita arrives. And he wasn't just a problem about music. I mean, he was a tough guy to get along with. Throughout his career, he's causing himself misery because he meddles and fusses so much. But it happened that in about 1660, one of the singers, who was the daughter of a Spanish aristocrat, her last name was Palomera, decided to go AWOL. And so she sneaked out of the convent for 24 hours with two of her male admirers. And it happened when Cozzolani was the abbess, and so she promptly notified her superiors. Well, Lita, who was never, the archbishop, who was never enthusiastic about nuns singing and was deeply suspicious of it, thought, well, this proves that Santa Radegonda is a sink of depravity and misbehavior. And so he cracked down, he forbid the nuns the sacrament, and for 2 years they were forbidden to sing. But the thing is, the Senate and the aristocratic families often supported the nuns. So the as we would say today, the whole matter was politicized. And so the ability to sing was restored in about 1663 or something. But then the Duke of Brunswick and his wife came on a grand tour, and the nuns obligingly sang mass and vespers for them. Well, the Duke of Brunswick was a heretic, a Protestant. So Lita just lost it. Here they were singing for heretics in their churches. And this just shows how evil convent music is, because it lures all these disreputable Protestants to the churches. So this time he banished all music from the convent for 8 years. And so this kind of hassle continues basically until about 1680, when things calm down a bit and another bishop takes over. So, and that is sort of symptomatic of the sort of thing that happened in some other cities. I mean, in Bologna, much the same thing. On the other hand, in Siena, the nuns always got along with their bishops, and so their music wasn't discouraged. In Venice, on the other hand, the rule was that the nuns not sing services. So in Venice, it was always outside musicians who did the performances. So every city tended to be a bit different.
Wow. We're gonna move on to another composer on our program, but I have only for our audience, I only have two questions left for Dr. Monson, and then we are going to take questions from you. And if you want to, you can put them in the chat, and Andrea from Seraphic Fire will compile them and will send them to me, and I will ask them to Craig. And so if there's anything that we've talked about so far that is interesting to you, we can certainly revisit it. And there may be something more about the next composer on our program. The final composer on the program, who represents about 25% of the composers on this program, is Antonio Vivaldi, who himself was a religious. He was consecrated as a priest. He had a relationship with a very famous orphanage, the Ospedale della Pietà. And for our listeners who maybe don't know about this institution and the musical sort of fame of it, can you describe what this place was and how one became a member of the choir of the Pietà? Because it's a little bit different,
Right.
than sort of the aristocratic convents that we've been talking about so far.
Right. Well, the Pietà was one of several such institutions in Venice, and they were as much about charity as they were about music. They existed primarily as orphanages for unwanted children. And there was a sort of what was called the rota, which was a barrel set in the wall with a section cut out of it. So you could put something in it and rotate it, and the people on the inside could remove whatever you'd put in without contacting the public outside. And so babies could be left in the rota. And it's worth remembering that not only the poor who couldn't support another child dropped off their babies at the ospedale, but also aristocrats who found the arrival of another inconvenient, perhaps illegitimate offspring, thought this was a likely candidate for dropping off at the ospedale. So these weren't simply, poor people's children. And they were taken in and raised within, and not just women. There were some male babies also dropped off. They were brought in, raised, and taught trades, often in the service industry as servants. But those with musical talent were trained as musicians. And this is what the aspect of the Ospedale that eclipsed all others, because so many women were trained as outstanding musicians. Some of the other women, the non-musicians, might be provided with a small dowry and then would marry, leave the convent. But many of the musicians lived their entire lives within the walls of the Ospedale. And as they became older, they became teachers, so that the beginners were taught by the more senior members of the choir and the orchestra. They lived a very regimented life, but it wasn't quite so regimented as nuns within convents. Some of them, the better ones, or as I imagine, the better behaved ones, were allowed to leave, actually, whereas nuns were strictly confined within the convent wall, and if you passed over it, you were excommunicated. The girl musicians from the Ospedale could go out for the day to teach or perform in the palaces of the aristocracy, so long as they were back before the sun went down. And again, this was useful for the institution, because these women, by giving lessons and performing, were forming links with the aristocracy, who could then become patrons of the institution. Another surprising thing to me, which I hadn't known, was that the Ospedale became so well known as a place to train female musicians that dukes from Germany sometimes sent their promising musicians to be trained at the Ospedale at the Duke's expense. And they were accepted with the stipulation that they never perform on the public stage, which again emphasizes this thing about women making music publicly was not acceptable. But if they performed in private in the convent, or in the choir lofts of the Ospedale, or in a princely environment, then it was acceptable. But to do so publicly was analogous to prostitution.
Really? So we think of nowadays, probably because of the 20th century revival of his music, we think of Vivaldi as being this superstar musician who sucked all the air out of the room, and the Pietà was this institution that worshipped and sort of and thought very highly of this incredible musician that they had. But he had a very different relationship with the Pietà than perhaps we think. Can you give us a sense of what the governors of the Pietà, the people who employed Vivaldi, where he wrote many concertos as well as choral music, including the Magnificat, which we are going to perform, what did they think of Vivaldi? Did they think of him as sort of a musical god, a bold-faced name in the way that we do now?
Well, he was in their stable of potential teachers. And in order to teach at the Ospedale, the Board of Governors had to vote you in, and you had to get a majority of votes in order to be employed for another year. It's interesting that Vivaldi never got a unanimous vote. And in several cases, several years, he got insufficient votes to be rehired. So they let him go. So his affiliation was a kind of on again, off again kind of relationship. And he was primarily known as the maestro del violino, the violin master, and he never got the more prestigious position of maestro del coro. There were times when he was brought in as a sort of sub, and he probably wrote some of his music for the choirs at that period, but he never actually got the prestigious title. And after 1637, they let him go and never rehired him again.
Oh. Is And we're friends who are listening in live. I'd like to invite you to, if you have any questions for us, to go ahead and put it in the chat. We already have one question, and this is since we brought up Hildegard. Um, uh, Jordan asks, were there Hildegard was a saint and a visionary. Were there any members of these convents that had a similar? Were there some that were canonized, or any that had sort of ecstatic visions in the same way that Hildegard did?
Not in the same way.
Mhm.
I mean, Hildegard is kind of a phenomenon unto herself, and she's also from a completely different period, so it's hard to make analogies. But in the same way that being a musician was a way of gaining status in the convent, being notable for piety was another way. And so there were some women that were extremely devout, and some of them, had visions. Some of them even received the stigmata, and some of them one of the Bolognese composer Lucretia Vitsana's aunts she never was made a saint, but she was beatified, so that she is remembered in the calendar of the institution for her piety. So there were women within the institution who played that sort of role. And I think it's remembering that the convents were made up of all sorts of women. There were the ones who were genuinely pious. There were the ones who could have cared less. There were the ones who excelled at music. There were ones who excelled in politics or fulfilling the convent offices. So it was a sort of diverse community that often managed to accept all these different ways of working out a life within the convent wall.
So the I you talked earlier, and I thought this was sort of a revelation, is that in the Baroque period, people didn't talk as much about the composer as they did the performers.
Right.
And what was the experience of the performance for the listener? Like, clearly it must have been something that was otherworldly and reported as such. If it wouldn't be so different if people wouldn't flock to this.
Right. Well, one has to remember they wouldn't have had the opportunity to hear women singing sacred music. All the sopranos in the cathedrals and the large churches were castrati or falsettists. And so that's a completely different kind of voice. And of course, I mean, Charles Burney, whom you mentioned earlier, mentioned that the cathedrals, I can't remember his exact wording, but it's something like they received the dross of the castrati, the ones who weren't good enough to make it in the opera, for example. So here was a chance to hear a kind of voice that was rarely heard in churches, and you also heard it in this kind of mysterious way, resounding and echoing from invisibly from up in the vaults of the church. And that's why they speak of voices as of angels or celestial sirens. And in those sorts of times, or I felt as if we were transported to heaven, and that sort of wording.
Oh, and so this is Felix asks a question which I think follows up quite well with this, which is, do we know how they sang in these convents in comparison to like what we think of as the way that we perform with professional singers now? Did they have clearly people who went to these concerts also went to the opera? Was there a different vocal quality that
we don't know at all. I mean,
okay.
when they speak about the character of the singing, it's usually in those very kind of rapturous general terms. The one who speaks most specifically is Charles Burney, who went around to a few convents during his time in Italy. And I mean, he says things like, it's some of the best singing I heard in Italy. And he may say that a soprano had a good trill, or something like that, but never that specific. Again, it's like so many of the details of this repertory and this kind of performance tradition, it's very elusive.
And this is a final question, which is we've talked a lot about Italy, but how is this specific to the
Oh
Italian
no,
peninsula? Oh,
oh
so
no.
this is throughout.
In the Catholic world, including the New World, a lot of work has been done in the last few years on convent singing in New Spain, in Mexico, for example. And there are a number of manuscripts of convent polyphony from the New World. There's important ones at the Newberry Library in Chicago, for example. So it was a common practice throughout the Catholic world. And in the Vatican Secret Archive, I remember finding documents sent about singing from convents in India,
Unbelievable.
and Mexico and South America,
So there is a repertoire that exists outside of just this music that was published by Italians in the
Right,
Baroque period.
right.
Wow, well, Craig, we're going to have you back at some point so that you can take us on the grand tour of convent singing throughout the European and convent and the New World. So,
Right. Well, in that case, I can give you the names of people who are much more expert on those areas than I.
well, Craig, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been a fascinating talk, and I know I speak on behalf of myself and our audience to say that it's a real honor to have you here. The show that we will be performing, which is both music by convent composers as well as music by Vivaldi, will be taking place from April 10th to April 13th in Boca Raton, Coral Gables, Fort Lauderdale, and Naples. And if you are interested, please visit our website, seraphicfire.org. Craig, thank you so very much for being here. We're really
Oh,
appreciative of it.
it's a pleasure. And
Uh,
and I have to say it's a perfect repertory. I mean, ending with the Vivaldi, which, you hear, oh, he didn't write 600 concertos, he wrote one concerto 600 times. But this piece is, I mean, it does what a liturgical piece for the Ospedale should do, in such attractive ways. I was really impressed. I hadn't listened to it for several years.
Yeah, it's a great piece. It has both virtuosity and depth to it. So
Right,
it's that perfect combination of having sort of taking you on an emotional journey, while also focusing on the performers and giving them a palette on which to
right,
perform.
right.
Um, well, thank you all for being here this evening. We hope to see you all at one of our future shows, and look forward to seeing you in the concert hall. Thank you, Craig, and goodbye, everyone.
Okay.
Bye bye.